It's Hyp3r Halloween!
First up on my Creatures from Beyond section is 1958's The Blob. Directed by Irvin Yerworth and written by Kay Lineker and Theodore Simonson, it's a movie that has been referenced, parodied, or even showcased in various forms of media. It's a teen horror B-movie that's scary at times, but is still very entertaining, and has left a lasting legacy on our media. The plot is simplistic, but effective. The Blob is set in the 1950s and centers around a space creature that lands on Earth and starts devouring the local townsfolk. Again, simple, but effective. The movie itself starts us off at Makeout Point. Couple Steve and Jane see a falling star crash nearby and decide to go off and look for the star. They aren't the first to arrive at the star, though. An old man lives nearby and he makes it to the fallen star before Steve and Jane. He does what anyone would do in this situation. He pokes it with a stick. The star is actually a small meteorite, and it cracks open, revealing a small amorphous creature. This creature is the Blob. It climbs up the man's stick and goes for his arm. The man can't get the Blob off, and he freaks out. Again, what anyone would do in this situation. Steve and Jane end up finding the man while searching for the meteorite. The old man with the Blob on his arm complains that he is in a great amount of pain due to the Blob. Steve and Jane drive him to the local doctor to get him checked out. Once there, they see that the Blob has actually spread up the man's arm, and it looks like it's gotten a bit bigger as well. The doctor tries to make sense of what's happening, and he equates the Blob to a parasite that is able to assimilate flesh at great speed. The doctor thinks that the best way to help the man is to amputate his arm. During this time, though, the doctor's nurse comes in to help, but she can't actually find the old man. She turns around, though, to find the Blob, which is now roughly the size of a beach ball. It's moving around on the floor, and it starts to go after the doctor and nurse. The doctor and nurse try to dissolve the Blob with acid, but, well, that doesn't work. The doctor goes for his gun, because he lacks common sense, and the gun proves ineffective as well. The Blob assimilates the nurse and goes after the doctor. Steve and Jane go back to the doctor's just in time for Steve to see the doctor get absorbed by the Blob. Steve and Jane rush to the police and, surprise, surprise, they don't believe them. They may not believe them, but they do indulge them because they do end up going to the doctors to investigate. Of course, the Blob is long gone, and some of the cops think this whole thing is a prank. The rest of the movie plays out in a similar fashion. The Blob finds a new isolated victim, absorbs that person, and moves on. The teens try to warn people, eventually getting some of their friends involved, but they can't really convince anyone. Steve and Jane find the Blob in a local market. They run and hide in a walk-in freezer, and that's when we see that the Blob doesn't seem to like cold areas. In the third and final act, the teens finally convince people to start buying into the Blob, and they all take action, searching all the buildings throughout the city. We also get one of the most iconic scenes in cinema history, with the Blob attacking the patrons of a local movie theater, causing everyone to run out screaming in terror, or smiling as is seen in some of the shots that they used. The Blob eventually traps Steve and Jane in a burning building, and that's where Steve remembers the incident in the freezer. He uses a fire extinguisher and repels the creature. Steve tells the cops that CO2 is the way to combat the Blob, and the cops blast it with all the CO2 they can find. Eventually, the townsfolk manage to freeze the Blob. The cops request that the Air Force transports the creature to the Arctic, and we see the Air Force drop the Blob into the ocean as we see the words, "The End," appear on the screen, which then morphs into a question mark. True to their word, there was a sequel to the Blob called Beware the Blob, and that movie was released in 1972. The sequel actually features the Blob that was sent to the Arctic, and not a different Blob creature. There was also a remake that came out in 1988 that changed the backstory of the Blob, but still retained a similar story. The 1988 version is a lot more gory than the original, which is fitting for 80s movies. I was actually going to discuss the 1988 remake in this year's Hyp3r Halloween, but I decided I wanted to focus on the original first. There was also apparently plans for another remake dating back to 2009. Rob Zombie had plans to remake this cult classic, but it hasn't come to fruition yet. So let's talk a little about the Blob itself. As I mentioned before, the Blob is very small when it arrives on Earth, but it gets bigger and bigger as it consumes people. The Blob itself is made of silicone. It's initially a milky translucent color, but it becomes redder as it consumes its victim. And this color change was actually achieved by adding red dye to the Blob every time it absorbed a person. Apparently the Blob that was used in this film still maintains its blobby qualities and has not dried out. It's normally on display during a yearly event called Blobfest. Now I hear you ask, what is Blobfest? Blobfest is an annual event in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, which is where the Blob was actually filmed. The festival is 3 days long and is primarily held in the Colonial Theater, the same theater that's featured in the Blob. Blobfest is 3 days long and features a street fair, tons of horror films, props from the Blob, and a recreation of the iconic running out of the theater scene from the original Blob movie. I've never been to the event, but it does look really fun. COVID caused the event to become an online-only event for 2 years, but it does appear to be back to an in-person event this year. Going back to what I said earlier, the Blob has been referenced, parodied, and showcased in various forms of media. One example is Killer Clowns from Outer Space. The beginning sequence of Killer Clowns is almost completely the same as the opening of the Blob. There are teens that make out point, and a couple sees a shooting star land nearby, and those teens go to investigate it. An old man finds it first, and is attacked in some way as well. There's also a scene in Ghostbusters 2 where slime oozes out of a vent, which is very similar to how the Blob oozes out of the vent in the theater. The Blob was also shown in the drive-in theater in Greece, which I guess is less of a reference to the film and just showing it, but hey, it's still referenced in another movie. One of the more recent references I can think of is actually from the Hotel Transylvania series. The Blob character, called Blobby, is less threatening and kid-friendly and looks more like a jello substance, but the reference is still there. Movies are just the tip of the iceberg though. Let's take a look at some cartoon and video game references, starting with video game references. The Blob is actually referenced by Paramedic in Metal Gear Solid 3 during a codec call. She ends up recapping the movie to Snake, although I don't quite remember what the point of her recapping it was. 1993's Clay Fighter also features a character called the Blob. It's a direct reference to the Blob itself, and he was actually one of my favorite characters back in the day because he had these really cool unique attacks. In terms of cartoon references, there are a ton more. The Blob is directly parodied in The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror 17, where Homer himself becomes the Blob. In another reference, Rocco from Rocco's Modern Life refers to Heifer as the Blob when the two are arguing about something. To directly quote Rocco, he says to Heifer that he saw him chasing down Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen, of course, plays Steve from the Blob. The real Ghostbusters also references the Blob with one of its episode's titles, The Slob. I do believe that's where the reference ends though, because I don't believe that episode actually has a Blob-like character. But it's been a while, so I'm not sure. One of my absolutely favorite references actually has to be in the 1980s Muppet Babies. The episode I'm referring to is The Invasion of the Muppet Snackers, which ironically is a reference to another horror movie. The story revolves around the Muppets finding something gross that their nanny is making and are worried that that is a new food for them to eat. Now, why this is one of my favorite references is because this episode actually used scenes from the Blob incorporated into the episode. If I remember correctly, Muppet Babies featured clips from various movies from time to time, so it wasn't out of the ordinary to see movie clips. It was crazy for me, though, to see scenes from a horror movie. I used to watch Muppet Babies when I was younger, and I remember being freaked out with this episode. I had only seen it once and thought maybe I had dreamt it up, but sure enough, it's a real episode. Granted, it didn't show any of the death scenes that I can remember, but as a young kid, seeing this movie monster oozing out of things really freaked me out. I could go on and on regarding the references, but I think I'll stop here. One last thing I'll bring up is the movie's theme song. I bet Attack of the Killer Tomatoes was inspired by this theme. The Blob's theme song describes what the Blob is and does with a very cool jingle. All that being said, the Blob is an iconic movie monster and I highly recommend checking it out. It's a classic that inspired many other movies out there. Check it out if you get the chance.